Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the September Free Press Book Club meeting. I am your admin, Erin Labar, and we're super happy to have everybody here. I'll do a quick round of introductions before we move on with the main part of the evening. Apologies for my voice. I'm kind of raspy after coming off a cold. So Ben Sigurdson, the Free Press Books editor, is back in the host seat tonight. We have McNally Robinson's Chris Hall, Charlene Diehl, the director of the Winnipeg International Writers Festival, who we are collaborating with for this book club meeting. And of course, our author, Margaret Sweatman. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Before we continue, I just want to acknowledge that we're all joining you from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This meeting will run as it usually does. I will get Charlene to do our introduction tonight, and Ben will lead off the Q&A, and then we will move into talking into next month's book. And with that, as my voice is now dissipating, I will throw to Charlene to introduce the Gunsmith's daughter.
Well, thanks so much, Erin. It's really nice to be here. This is my second visit. So I was here last September for the book club. When it coincides with the Writers Festival, it's just a special treat for us. So
we love having you.
Thank you. It's wonderful, and I was especially happy to be offered the opportunity to introduce Margaret and the Gunsmith's daughter. Margaret Sweatman, I think pretty much everybody here in this city, at least, is familiar with Margaret. She's an award-winning novelist. She's also a playwright. She also is an expert lyricist and a singer and a harmonica player, and she's always on the cusp of some kind of new project. So she's a person who is kind of one of the nodes of inspiration in this city. She's recently retired as a creative writing and lit professor. Before it killed her, she got out because she had much writing to do, and so we're kind of watching her come back into her full creative power. She is a longtime friend of mine, as well as someone who has been one of my kind of points of inspiration as a person who has a distinctive voice, extraordinary sense of language, unbelievable attention to precise detail, characterization, and all of those things are writ large in The Gunsmith's Daughter, which I just inhaled. It's not like Margaret's other books, but it still has all those stamps that I would expect, that extraordinary presence of voice and the really incisive exploration of relationships inside of families and those sort of larger social structures that we live in and sometimes don't see because they're almost too close to be able to make out. And I think that's one of the things that I would say is true of all Margaret's writing, is that she just will not look away from hard stuff. And I think that all of her writing brings us things that sometimes make us slightly uncomfortable, but will also make us laugh, will make us feel little shocks of recognition and a great deal of compassion for one another and also, I think, ourselves. I think The Gunsmith's Daughter is spectacular, and I think that a lot of people are going to be reading this book and responding to it just so positively. So I'm really delighted to be part of the circle that gets to talk to you, Margaret. Over to you.
Well, I'm with all these angels, like these, you see our screen, like I've got these angels. And I want to thank you all very much for all the attention you give to writing and to writers. And my beloved friend, Charlene, we've been friends for many, many years, and she's one of the most important people in my life. And talk about inspiration, I think about her often. Her and her shoes, her great shoes, and her friendships, and her unbelievable intelligence. Anyway, thank you so much. And to the Free Press, I have to just say, this is the Free Press. Everyone in the country envies Winnipeg, the Free Press. It's one of the very, very few newspapers that gives attention to books and to artists in a real way, in not just feeding out propaganda. So thank you. And to McNally, Robertson, holy mackerel, as you know, everyone in North America knows about McNally Robertson. I have nightmares about you guys folding up, so please stick around. And so the Gunsmith's daughter, yeah, okay. This little scene is from the first act, first part, and it is, I excised it. Some of it's from page 34 in part 1, but I tried to make it, I cut some of the F words and, and tried to abbreviate it to 5 minutes. So.
Oh, you don't have to cut the F words on our behalf. Well, I shouldn't say I probably speak for Chris and for Charlene, but I shouldn't speak for the general book club reading public, I guess. Okay. So do what you must.
All right. Okay. I hope that it's okay. I think it'll be okay. And in this scene, Lilac Welsh is the protagonist, and it's about her relationship with her father, Cal Welsh, who's the gunsmith. And Lilac has just had her first sexual encounter with a young man, Gavin, who is on his way to join the Marines, like Canadians did. About 30,000 Canadians joined to go and fight in Vietnam, sadly. And they're coming back into this house on the Winnipeg River, a very remote place. Lilac's parents regarded them remotely. Ruby, Lilac's mother, spoke. "Do you know how long you've been gone? For God's sake, Lilac, it's nearly dark. You left at 2. I saw you head out and I just was astounded. Why didn't you tell me where you're going? What if something went wrong? I've said this countless times. How on earth can I find you if I don't know where you are?" Ruby's anger always burned white hot, and she never played dirty. It was true. Lilac normally did tell her parents where she was going when she took a boat out. Accidents happen. They had only each other. Cal was rigorous about his family's safety, always lecturing on the subject of their isolation and necessary dependence on him, even while he drilled Lilac on self-sufficiency. Years ago, he taught her how to apply a tourniquet and how to stitch a small wound. Ruby came around the table to embrace her. "Honestly," she said, "honestly, darling," and held her. The peppery smell of Ruby's red hair. Lilac looked through her mother's curls at her father, still seated with his glass of whiskey. Cal, her father, had the stiff-necked, slow-eyed glaze he earned with a third drink. She noticed his hunting knife, and his left hand pressed flat beside it while he held his drink with his right. Her father's square, scarred hands were always clean, unless he'd been dressing an animal. He kept a bristle brush by the kitchen sink to clean his nails. He caught his daughter's eye, and with the fingers of his left hand, he snapped open the sheath and withdrew the steel blade. He drank off the whiskey, then took an apple and began to peel the skin thinly into a red and white spiral he let fall to the floor between his feet, his boots, unlaced as always, the soles sloppy, a result of ankle pronation. Lilac felt a certain revulsion for her father's feet. Other than by accident, by virtue of his strength and his distracted willpower, Cal had never hurt her physically. He'd once given her a nosebleed by smacking her in the face with his elbow while he was starting a chainsaw. But he appeared to be more than a little drunk and angry. She wondered if he was going to stand up and stride toward her. It seemed as if he knew what had happened with Gavin that afternoon, and she resented her own sense of shame. Ruby hugged Lilac for a long time, swaying, and Lilac let it go on, listening to her mother's body and the sound of her father's teeth when he bit into the apple. Ruby murmured in her ear, "Take it easy tonight. Don't let him get you riled." She pulled away and announced more gaily, "Let's take it easy tonight." She went to the propane oven and opened it, permitting a warm wave of roasting meat. Ruby said, "Lilac, get the salad out of the fridge." Lilac had to squeeze around her dad in his chair. Excuse me, to open the fridge door. She was chilled and wet and trying to put aside her resentment that she had to help out before she'd even had a chance to change her clothes. The salad was on the bottom shelf and she leaned over to pick it up. She heard her father move suddenly and shove his chair away from the table. His voice made a strange sound. The chair tipped and fell backwards. Cal moved quickly toward Gavin, moving so close he bumped him chest to chest, saying, "So, this is how you repay my hospitality?" Gavin faced him unblinking. Cal backed off. "Is this what you do?" He righted the chair and then slammed it into the floor, the stone floor he'd procured from a quarry near Vermilion Bay. He seemed to like the sound of it because he slammed the chair into the floor again, harder. The chair splintered, dismembering the legs from the seat. Now he held the back of the chair before him like a shield. Cal went on. "Did you open my house? Make yourself uncomfortable? You betray me?" Cal was now charging into the living room toward the liquor cabinet, which just happened to be beside the gun cabinet. From the doorway, she watched him pour bourbon with an air of personal grievance that made her heart freeze. She wanted to get away from him. Cal poured himself another drink and was about to down it when he stopped, staring into the booze, weighing it against something in his own mind. Kind of old-fashioned, isn't it? Boy shows up and deflowers the landowner's daughter like a goddamn fairy tale or something. Ruby said, "That's enough," and closed the oven door. Without even looking at Cal, she said clearly, "If you drink that, I'm leaving you." Lilac found it painful to witness her father's humiliation. He didn't wear humility well. He was listening to her mother as if he'd like to inhale her. He winced and said gruffly, "I overspoke." Thank you.
Oh boy, what an amazing passage to choose, and what an amazing reader you are. I mean, it just brings so much life. Well, I mean, not that there's not life in the passage to begin with, but it's just to hear you hear you read it was just like so thrilling. So thank you so much for doing that. I'm sorry, I'm a little out of practice. I haven't hosted a book club for like 4 or 5 months or something like that.
That's good.
I have lots of notes, but that was remarkable, and I found The Gunsmith's Daughter to be just an incredible book. Gosh, where to start? Do you want to talk a little bit about the genesis of this novel? I mean, that's usually where I sort of start with authors who come on and talk about their books. We did also have a reader sort of paraphrase the reader's question. What inspired you to write about the development of a weapon, or where did the germ of the story originate?
Yeah. One of the very, very, very first inspirations was Huckleberry Finn, Lilac Welsh and Huck Finn, and the journey. And at first I went to the Mekong Delta. I went to Vietnam and studied the Winnipeg River, McNally, and the Mekong Delta, the river, and the idea that the river as a journey. And the weapon partly came, as I say in the book at the end, in my acknowledgements. I found that 50 caliber rifle with the help of my friend, Jake McDonald, who knew, he died in 2019, but he knew a heck of a lot about guns. But I think it was from the violence of the 1960s and 70s where I was coming of age. And I lived in Edmonton in my first year of university. I went to the University of Alberta to study theater and lived with a bunch of draft dodgers. And we would smoke pot and watch the Jungle War. And I think that kind of rock and roll, homelessness, Rolling Stone gathers no moss, reading Rolling Stone magazine, that there was a violence at the heart of my early adulthood. And the gun came to symbolize the betrayal I think also stories are at the heart of of stories that we love, like say the Odyssey, is betrayal. And the gun is a betrayal. It's betrayal of human beings. I'm going to shoot each other. Not a kind thing.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was, it seems, a sort of a watershed moment, if you will, when it comes to reporting and nonfiction writing, as in our general sort of timeline of that kind of stuff. And so that you latched on to a young reporter trying to sort of find herself, find her way, and make it in the world, and going to this highly traumatic place was just so moving and so yeah, compellingly written. It was just amazing.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll say too, the research, I owe a lot to this book called War Torn, where these young journalists, they were women, a group of women contributed to this book called War Torn, which I only found through Aid Books, like it's out of print. Unfortunately, maybe they'll reprint it. They went there, and they were from Australia and the US, and they were in their early 20s. And they went to report on this war, even from the 60s right up till 75. And then they went on to become war correspondents. So yeah, I was inspired by their unbelievable courage.
Well, and that sort of, well, where should I go with this? Well, I'll jump down to a reader question, because someone had asked about, or had mentioned, a documentary called Vietnam, Canada's Shadow War, a 2015 documentary directed by a Manitoban, saying it comes as no surprise that Canadian companies profited by manufacturing materials used in the Vietnam War. However, knowledge about women war correspondents is not as well known, even though there were hundreds of women accredited journalists who covered Vietnam. This reader asks, was there a specific Vietnam era woman journalist who was your inspiration for Lilac, or was it a compilation such as the well-known trio of Kate Webb, Catherine Leroy, and Frances Fitzgerald?
Yes, actually, I don't know the last two names, but the first one is among these incredible contributors to this book, War Torn. So yeah, they, one of the many things I love about these reportage is someone asked them how they managed to survive. And one of the correspondents writes, Scotch and sex. and the honesty of that, and the youthful honesty of that is so sort of true to the rock and roll life that I inherited. So yes, and then of course there's the other journalists who are making their way to find a way to write in an objective subjectivity, where they're noticing, they're keeping a notebook, and they're lucid enough to write down what the heck they're seeing, and to experience extreme situations in ways that I hugely admire, like Joan Didion, that kind of writing where you are there and you're vulnerable and everyone thinks you're crazy because you're too thin, or like with Didion, and with these young women, these young women, you're too young, and yet you are still able to take notes. One of the journalists writes about lying down in a field full of dead young bodies and watching a butterfly. So that kind of courage to see when you are in that much crisis is very inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I desperately wanted to, this book desperately made me want to be able to read what Lilac was writing, read what Larry could have written had he sort of been able to sort of follow through on his reportage of Cal. I was It was, I mean, it's a great sort of narrative tension, because it's like you keep hoping that you're going to see this, but then, you just sort of see what happens around it. And, when these people sort of come and go, how the rest of the characters sort of react. Oh boy, there's about 100 different directions I could go in here. Do you want to talk, Chris, Charlene, do you want to jump in with any questions right now? I'm free to relinquish.
I do actually.
Yes.
I wanted to say, Margaret, that the passage that you read is chilling. And I thought often in this book that the scenes in Vietnam, which were also often just terrifying, but they didn't suck the air out of my lungs any more than the private sort of the scenes of kind of more of a more intimate violence. That, like watching the father flip open the knife blade, everything just kind of my blood kind of runs cold. And I thought often that the kind of violence that just churns through this whole novel, you were kind of invited into this young woman who has basically been navigating danger her whole life, is how it felt to me. And so in some ways she's perfectly positioned to be able to go and look at things that are too hard to look at, too hard to see.
Yes.
And so I wondered if you would just talk a little bit about, the novel is actually called The Gunsmith's Daughter. So at the core of the novel that you're signaling to me as a reader is that there's something about this dynamic between a father who represents a certain way of being in the world and a daughter who has another way of being. And in that scene, I know as it unfolds a bit, one of the things that Lilac is so pissed off about is that how could her father call her his property? And so that kind of, I think that also lays on top of the, like, who has the right to be in Vietnam fighting this war, and who owns what, and does might make right? And there's a certain kind of fragility in the father that we see often, and that I think Lilac sees, and it offends her, and it also scares her, and it also makes her want to be protective of him. So I just thought there was so much density and intensity in that relationship, and I wondered if you would talk about the way that sort of maps onto the war setting that, where she takes herself.
Yeah, thanks. Like, well, in a simple way, there's an allegory between Canada and the US, and he's an American, and he's a sociology prof who's brought up to Manitoba from Michigan, where at University of Michigan, the University of Michigan was sending advisors in the early 60s, so he was among them to Vietnam. And so in a way, it's kind of about our trap with the US. And we are dependent, codependent, we siphon off ourselves. There's unfortunately such an intricate relationship now that we'll never, ever, of course, break free. And I think too, one of the experiences when I was writing a draft was I was hearing a hair-raising interview with a woman whose father was a serial killer. And I thought, you know what? Weapons manufacturers are serial killers. And what is it like for a woman to experience violence in a man that she innately loves and loves as part of her DNA? And what is it like to have violence in your DNA? As Canada, we have violence in our DNA, not only from our British colonial history, but our relationship with the States. And in the 70s, I was a student. We were so rich. The country was so rich, and it was from selling nickel and berets and parts of weapons. So it feels as if it's like in the details of a kitchen scene, there's all these traps for people who love each other and can't escape each other. And the violence is also a valence, like a chemical reaction between a male and a female. She hears her father eat the apple, and she can feel his teeth, and she knows his feet. So it's the physicality of that maleness in her life that teaches her how to do a tourniquet, gives her herself, but then she's beholden to this psychopathic kind of willpower that will give her also her inheritance. So I do think that Canada is implicit in a larger, that is our problem. We're selling weapons to Yemen. So here we are in our lovely compromise and democracy and survival.
Well, there are so many descriptions of Cal smelling of gun oil and soap, which was like such a great sort of contrast of, like
Yes.
clean and cleaning, and also just like the
Yes.
underlying dirtiness of the whole situation.
Yes. And it's sort of the carnivorous quality of the kind of life that brave people often have to live,
Yeah. Chris, do you have anything you want to jump in with?
Sure.
If not, no, that's fine.
Well, I was going to take the conversation towards Lilac as well, because I was struck by just how captivating a character she was, and considering she's in a novel with war and all these ideas and so on, to hold your own in that was quite remarkable. And so when I'm listening to you speak so far, I mean, we can talk a lot about the nonfiction, quote unquote, of this story, but what is it about the fiction, these fictional characters and these fictional situations that allow you, like, what do you get at with that in a way that you can't just by telling the nonfiction?
Yeah, lovely. Well, I can't tell you what an honor this is to talk to you like this, but the characters kind of show up and you listen to them. In some of the bad times writing this novel, I think she's Pippi Longstocking. Just like, what am I doing? I'm going off to war, and so I had to really, really live with her and experience the novel. I had, of course, some drafts where her pitch wasn't right, and then I could finally just hear her and go with her, and then she discovers, like, Bull is one of a sort of surrogate father, and Larry Donovan, another surrogate father. They did show up for her, and it is a very wonderful, platonic, magical thing that fictional characters, if you live in the story long enough and try to stay quiet and put out enough decoys, they will come to you. And in a way, though, too, and I'll say this maybe to the many writers who might be listening, and that with a protagonist, you have to leave I think it's wise to leave an empty space around them so that the reader can go into them. So I don't really describe her, except people tell her that she's pretty and tall. And
She has big feet.
Big feet. I loved her big feet and her canoe shoes. But other than that, I tried to leave her as an avatar for us to experience the story, which is how I wrote it, where I could go with her and tried to see without ideology. Like, another thing about her is that she's, as a journalist, she's a talent. She's a talented journalist. She calls herself a rocket, and she knows she is, and a good photographer. And she knows that in order to do that, and in order, in a way, also to love her father and even her mother, because her mother's compromised too, she has to try and avoid ideology. And so that helped in a way with living with her, because I could go into a scene and see the lighting and see the unknowingness of a scene with her and whether she was very hungry all the time. She has a high metabolism. So she was often kind of dizzy with hunger. So I could go in there and be dizzy with hunger and fear and drive. She's willful. So I just sort of rode her. She was my broom, and I could go with her. It's very fun to live with a character.
Well, and so that sort of leads into a question that I had about writing historical fiction, writing fictional characters into, a real life historical event, and what that is like. I think a lot of people, and there were a couple of questions from readers that sort of went down this path as well, are interested in the research that you would have done. I mean, you say you obviously went to Vietnam, and whether there was and this is just sort of my side, sort of whether there was anything that was, overly more surprising than anything else that you would have learned in your, this is about an 8-part question, I'm sorry. But I am interested in sort of the parallel between writing a fictional narrative inside of a non-fiction, like a real event, and then what that is like for. I mean, you've done it, many times over. So in your career.
Yeah, it's tricky, and with this one, it was a little less sort of Zelig, a little much less postmodern than other historical fiction I've written. This one was, because of my avatar, my protagonist. It had I was inhabiting that research more. I found it difficult to keep looking at guns, like they scare me, and I found that kind of quite hard to understand what a muzzle brake is, and how the gas system works, and watching people shoot 50 caliber shoulder fired rifles, and to read books like American Sniper. Like, the movie's one thing, but the book is heartbreaking, because the narrator feels utterly convinced that he is a warrior, and that it is very important that he kill people who are the enemy, women, children. So I found that really tiring and saddening to inhabit that space, as every writer who goes into this kind of story does. Maybe too about research, some of the hard research is actually learning some of the drier stuff about the history of the country. But to go there and experience the country after I'd done the research, then you'd sort of do this sort of dry research about its colonial history, and about the French, and about its relationship with Buddhism and Catholicism. And then you can go and you've read the map, so you can go and try and breathe into it again. So whenever it became boring, which it rarely did, I mean, one thing about this war is that the research is amazing, and the journalism and histories and first-person accounts. I mean, this was Rolling Stone magazine coming into this world, and first-person accounts, and also subjectivity and drugs and hallucinations entering into reportage. One of the books, though, that I read over and over and over again, back to front, was Graham Greene's Quiet American. Because it is the perfect book, and it was writing about the 50s, 1950s, and the French War, and early 50s, 40s and 50s, and the fear and the betrayal. I think so. It was a really various. Some of the most interesting literature was psychoanalytic as well. That really helped. Achilles in Vietnam, Jonathan Shea, where he's writing about Homer, but he's writing about what it's like to sit in a room with a man who's been traumatized in 1978. He's working with him 3 years after the end of the war, and he's screaming at his kids, so it was a range of of dry history, classical war literature, and reportage. Yeah, but is it ever beautiful literature around that war?
I was going to follow up about historical fiction, because there's different kinds of historical fiction. Like if you go through the bookstore, especially right now, there's an awful lot of books that have war as a setting, but war is almost like a backdrop, which is kind of as a reader, you're kind of kept shielded from, while a relatively pleasant story happens in front of that. You've written quite a different book, and one of the reader questions is about how unsettling a couple of chapters in particular are. So what, like that's a decision too. What made you want to actually confront and force us to confront the
sorry about
war?
that. And my editor did suggest that some people might be hurt by it, but we do live it. And one of the essays I used is by a wonderful researcher who's teaching, I believe, at York, but in the East, and a Vietnamese Canadian who's looking at her own history, and she looked at it, and I thought, this would be easier for me in a way. And also it's on YouTube, and it's on tonight's news, obviously, with her wars. So yeah, I felt worried about that, but I think Canadian literature is often very soft paw with violence. And this, I thought, well, I should try to state what happened. I mean, they did burn children, Miley did, all of that did happen. These massacres did happen. And it's on the computer, my grandchildren can watch it. And so, like, I don't know why we wouldn't really. I hope it's not, like, sometimes I read violence in literature and I feel that it's frankly pornographic or something, or sadomasochistic or something. I do think this is historical and journalistic, and that it did happen. So, I mean, it is so shocking. It is so shocking that type of liquid gasoline, that oily gasoline, was used, and it did happen. So there we are. Yeah.
And I think people today, or younger people or whatever, when they think about Vietnam, the things that they associate with the most probably are, either probably movies like Apocalypse Now, or something along those lines. Sort of not trying to equate your book with any of that, but there is like a very propulsive sort of quality to it that is almost cinematic or whatever. And I'm just sort of wondering if you were sort of thinking, and the music as well, that you sort of inject in here and there, sort of, I thought did a great job as well. And I'm just getting a thing popping up here. A question from a reader along the same note: if this story were to be adapted for the screen, which actors would be her choice for the lead characters? You can sort of answer that at your own discretion. But I was just sort of interested in sort of the flow of it and the feel of it, which did feel sort of like these movies, but maybe it's because that's sort of how we get the Vietnam War mostly these days. Is that a question that makes any sense?
Well, I think I think I see, when I'm writing scenes, I see the lighting first, and so that kind of gives the feel for it. Is first see the lighting, and I have been looking at screenwriting, and I do find that I love that one scene can tip into the next. I love theater and love film. And so I do love that feeling, that how you can make one scene invite the next scene. I don't think I ever thought of like that lovely question about casting, but I think the characters, when you're writing a book, have to just belong to the book, you know. Otherwise, you might separate from them. So you have to stay in there, friends with them. Can't hire them yet.
That makes total sense to me. I'm sure probably, you know, based on your descriptions, we all have varying degrees of difference between sort of similar visual characteristics of you know, of Larry, of Bull, of Cal, of Lilac, of all of them, and Ruby.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me just see. Charlene, you want to jump in with anything, or Chris?
I wanted to just pick up something that you said back there, Margaret, where you were saying this particular novel, unlike earlier novels that you've written, which also have historical settings, this one was a little less Zelig, which is a great description. But when I was reading, I think, oh, this feels like a very different kind of storytelling here. It does feel a little bit less stylized, maybe, and like I was so sort of sucked into the character in that sort of, in the way that you say, like an avatar sort of way, that I felt like I was on the inside kind of experiencing, and I wasn't necessarily aware of that little extra distance where, like, how is this being offered to me? How is this being told? And then there's that lovely little moment later in the book when Lilac is watching Larry sort of not interview her dad, and she's thinking, oh yeah, it's sort of that feigned indifference, like all we're doing here is just having a drink. And she's sort of watching, you know, like he's sort of playing out the line, you know, he's basically catching her father, and her father's going to say things that he's not protecting, because he's kind of lured in, I guess, or sort of, you know, lured into story. So I really paused there and thought, yeah, there's a thing here that's going on. But I thought of it again when you said about the beautiful reportage and the fact that so much of this period, the 60s and 70s, actually it's an easy reach of hearing how and seeing how it was, right? So there's like lots of reporting happening. There's film, there's pictures, so in a way, maybe there's less pressure to invent or to invite people as readers to be kind of entering a different register to take in stories. So it just feels like a different kind of novel. So what I was thinking is, so does the period of this one, is that directly what's impacting the way that you are telling the story, the way that you're handling the genre conventions of a novel? Because it doesn't feel like your earlier novels.
Yeah, and it's different from the one that I'm working on now, which is again much more stylized. I think it did take several drafts to hear this novel, to hear The Gunsmith's Daughter. 3-4 drafts. One of the drafts was in the first person, and it just didn't work. It was Lilac's, and it just didn't work. And so I had to dig and dig and dig and dig and dig, and it scared me because I remember saying to Catherine Hunter, a beloved friend, I can't hear this book, and she was saying, well, just keep going, keep going. I couldn't hear it, and so when I finally heard it, it was Lilac, and then I just listened to what she was seeing, and her courage. I kind of just had to ride with her, and I think that, again, yes, what you're saying, Charlene, is that it really is a contemporary history. It was when I was, I lived this history, however protected, ridiculously protected, but. Say the work I'm doing right now is as highly stylized, a sort of romance writing, which I really love to do. At one point when I read this book, when it first came in the mail, I looked at it and thought, it's flat. It's flat. I wrote a flat book. everyone's going to laugh at me, because it didn't have that thing that I love, the ball bouncing around and all that heat on the surface. What I really love about writing, it's not there. I think it actually is this water slide, which I also have always wanted to do, make a water slide. And so I did worry. Sometimes when I read it, I think, geez, it's just this stuff happening. And I think Mr. Jones' novel before this was working towards this, where I was trying to reduce phrases, pull back on the sentences, and then now the work I'm doing now is ridiculous sentences, comma fusion, hell.
You've done an amazing job with the Gunsmith daughter, I think. So we just had a reader question. Maybe I'll try and work this in with sort of something that I had sort of typed out as well. You've got Cal's presence sort of looming so large over Lilac as well as Ruby. They're sort of continuing to orbit closer and further from him throughout the book. She leaves, she goes to Winnipeg. She goes to Vietnam. He comes there, he leaves, goes to Michigan, and she goes there, and what have you. His presence never fully subsides. The reader question, that was my preamble. The reader question is, the book is so rich with so much depth, as you've described all these things that we can't escape from in our own lives and families. What do you ultimately want to leave the reader with? It's sort of a big question.
I don't know. I have no idea. I'm very honored by that question and by that observation. No, I actually really don't know. Leaving, no, I actually don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. I don't know. I can only hope that we are, that we maintain our interest in Canadian literature, one thing that any of my generation is watching is that we don't know the lists right now very much, and so I hope that people will read Canadian writers and maintain the faith that we're trying to tell a story that is ongoing. And is always under review.
So I didn't mean to throw you for a loop there, but I was really interested.
Can I offer something in there?
Yes, please.
So I'm just going to be Margaret's footnote, which wouldn't be the first time, hey?
That'd be quite an honor, I would think, too.
What I think as a reader, Margaret, it goes back to what you said earlier about the soft paw. The way that, sort of the way that we want to think of ourselves as a culture, yes, is this sort of, like we kind of maintain a determined innocence, yes, and naivete. And it seems to me this whole novel is kind of like peeling back and making explicit what we would rather not, yes, acknowledge. Yes. So it is sort of responsibility, sort of participation. It's like what is interior, and how it's much easier to think that the violence and the violation is outside of us as individuals or as a culture, as a country. And I feel like this novel over and over again puts it so far, like right at the solar plexus, so that you can't really escape. That, it feels to me, is like the core of the novel. I thought, my God, you must have been just in a state of high anxiety the whole time you were writing it. Because I was in a state of high anxiety as I read it. I mean, appreciation and kind of all that beautiful forward motion, but also just to me, it like brings something home that I think is a very important aspect of our lives. And this is not a very far away history, but as you say, it's like playing and playing and playing. It's not gone, right? It's not, it's very current.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. I mean, that war has led to chronic war. Eh? Those helicopters being tipped off the ship in 1975, they're still being like and the police state and the low grade violence and Canada's participation in that is ongoing.
Well, and I
And
think
the appetite for money.
yeah, and I think it's probably in the last 10 months to a year has become once again so front of mind because of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, and that is clearly a conflict that is not going. There's no neat end one way. It's just going to be an ongoing, messy, a catastrophic and devastating conflict that does in many ways sort of harken back to Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean the war, the early days in the 60s, and then with Kennedy's assassination, it really was the beginning of a thug government. Unfortunately, it's a comedy. This book. No, it's very tough. Not a big laugh.
When I was trying to figure out back in the spring when I was first reading it and first trying to figure out how best to describe it, I just stumbled on a line that it takes the local for us and takes it out into the biggest issues and ideas and problems the world has. And so, and in one of the reader questions, somebody has taken it right down to a familiarity with McNally that's beyond me. I'm not as familiar with McNally. I can imagine it because I get close to it, but not that close to it. And so somehow, just to tie that into your comments about reading Canadian writers, reading local writers, like something about that connection that spins it. This is about me, not about even a neighbor, let alone somebody in the next province or somebody else that we always seem to get away with saying.
Yeah.
That's not a question either, but
and it's all about taking us from Rough Rock to Winnipeg and then to Vietnam and then to sort of taking us around and experiencing all of these things that it was incredible, and your ability to sort of transport the reader from place to place, and in doing, as that happens, the situation is obviously very different. So the writing sort of shifts a little bit too, and there's more, that there's more going on in Vietnam. So there's, versus, working at the Winnipeg Tribune. It was so thrilling. It was just so moving. Yeah.
I was wondering if the Free Press or the Tribune would have actually sent somebody over that far for, as I was reading it, but as I say, I was so captivated. I wasn't asking questions like that while I was reading. But then the Free Press sent somebody over to Ukraine. So it's like, I guess it's realistic.
That's a sort of, it's a conversation to have, maybe not on the Zoom, but I think that yes and no. I'll just put it that way. And I don't know all the details, so I won't try.
Well, it worked for me, Ben.
Okay, there you go.
Convinced me.
Yeah. That's good.
One thing, about this period of the 60s and 70s was there was a certain brutality that I dealt with in the novel called The Players in 1660, which felt like a very rock and roll period where it was women right at your own risk. And it was a tough time. There was actually quite a revolutionary attitude towards feminism at that period.
So as we're just about to wrap up, because I see Aaron popped up, it was perfect timing. You said you're working on something else. Now, I know most writers don't like to divulge too much information. Any hints or anything you want to give, or you're just best to sort of hands off and see what comes?
Well, it might be awful and it's probably terrible.
That's fair. That's fine.
Yeah.
I had to try.
Yeah, no, and I really, and it will, I will say, instead of history, I'm trying geology and mining and deep memory, the notion of what's released through people experiencing earthquakes, for example, when we're reminded of how small we are when the earth shifts. So, and it's called Night Birds. So it's about diving for your foraging rather than linear time.
Sounds amazing.
Anyway.
Sounds amazing, Margaret. If it's even a fraction of as good as the Gunsmith daughter was, I'm all over that. Like,
Thank you.
No question. So, but yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time and coming to talk to us. It was fantastic. I loved it.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your super insightful questions and answers and discussion. Just a brilliant discussion about a brilliant book. So I'm thrilled to have y'all here. Before I do my end of meeting spiel, I'm going to throw over to Charlene to talk a little bit about anything that's upcoming with the Thin Air Festival, because it runs for a couple more weeks yet, right?
Yes, we're 1/4 of the way through. So we're humming along until the 18th. And I should say that you can actually go to the festival site and see Margaret on a shooting range. Because all of our writers, we basically invite them to pre-record content. So there's a kind of like a labyrinth of a video content at thinairfestival.ca. So this is one of the ways that we're trying to straddle the hybrid structure with a lot of content that's available for anyone to visit whenever they want between now and the end of October 18th. And then sprinkled around the rest of the way are events that are either online like this or in person. So all of there's a calendar on that site as well. And there's just tons of really, really, really amazing stuff. And I'm not lying about the shooting range. So I really hope people will check it out. We've had a great first week. I guess I'd probably, there's a bunch of things happening at McNally Robinson starting next week, starting this weekend, I guess, on Saturday with Anhart. Marie Anhart Baker is going to be launching. And then after that, it's just poppity pop for the next week. So also there's all sorts of posts on the McNally site as well, because, you know, John is the most organized person on the planet, I swear. So it's really been a great start already. And it's really fun for us to have a chance to do, as Margaret says, you know, kind of find who are the writers in our country right now that are telling like really compelling, interesting stories from many, many points of view. And then, you know, a few kind of international writers popping in here and there. But to me, the core value of a writers' festival is making a platform, making a space for many kinds of stories, many kinds of voices to emerge so that we know better who we are.
Well, that's a pretty lofty statement to end the meeting on.
We aim high.
I feel like I'm going to
Love
just
it.
like bring everybody down now.
No, it's great. It's great. And it's Charlene's 20th festival, which congratulations. It's amazing.
20. Yes. Wow.
So I'm going to be mindful of everyone's time and just talk briefly about our next month's pick, which is The Full Catastrophe by Mara. Is it Miera? Miera. Okay, I'm sure she'll correct me next month.
It's a wonderful book. Yeah,
I'm really excited for this one. Miera is from South Africa originally, and now she lives in Winnipeg. She's a poet, fiction writer. This is her 4th novel, I believe. It's her newest novel, so really excited to dig into this. I just wanted to make a quick note that next month's meeting is not on the last Monday of the month because that is Halloween. So we are doing it on the second to last Monday, the 24th of October.
I might dress up anyway.
I mean, you can. We could do book club, book themed costumes.
Everyone comes as their own personal catastrophe.
Already here.
That'll be easy.
Yeah.
It will be.
So yeah, we'll see you all next month on October 24th. And I want to thank Chris, Charlene, Ben, and Margaret again for this fabulous discussion. And yeah, we'll see you all again next month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. What a joy.
Thank you.